before the final gunfire faded. Across the jungles of Luzon, before rifles were set aside and flags lowered, there was a promise. It carried across the Pacific with quiet certainty. I shall return. But promises are easy to make in moments of strength. The real question is what remains when the one who makes that promise is forced to leave. And what happens to the man who stays behind knowing how the story is likely to end? In March 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, one departure would echo far beyond the battlefield. And one decision made weeks later would carry a weight far greater than defeat. This is not a story of victory in the usual sense. It is a story of endurance, responsibility, and the burden that comes with command. At its center is a man who never sought the spotlight, Jonathan Wainwright. Before the war reached the Philippines, life followed a steady, familiar rhythm. Mornings began with soft light over rice fields and coastal villages. Fishermen moved out onto calm waters, and children traced the same narrow paths between homes and fields. The pace was unhurried, shaped by routine and tradition. American troops, stationed across the islands, lived in a world that felt both distant and secure. They trained, wrote letters home, and spoke of the war in Europe and Asia as something unfolding elsewhere. It was serious, but it still felt far away. That distance vanished in December 1941. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck across the Philippines. Airfields were hit, ships were lost in harbor, and communication lines broke down under the pressure of a coordinated assault. The islands, vital to the balance of power in the Pacific, yet difficult to defend quickly, became a central battleground. At the head of Allied forces was General Douglas MacArthur, a confident and experienced commander who understood both the strategic importance of the Philippines and the challenge of holding them. But the speed and coordination of the Japanese advance left little room for recovery. What followed was not a single decisive moment, but a steady collapse. Allied forces were pushed back step by step toward the Bataan Peninsula. It was a fighting withdrawal carried out under constant pressure. Plans shifted from defense to delay, from holding ground to buying time. Supplies began to run short. Reinforcements never arrived. Food was rationed more strictly with each passing week. Medical supplies became scarce. Tropical conditions added their own strain, heat exhaustion, and disease spreading through already weakened ranks. Even so, the line held. Not because victory seemed likely, but because there was no alternative. Then came the decision that would redefine the campaign. In March 1942, MacArthur was ordered to leave the Philippines. The directive came from Washington. His presence was needed elsewhere to organize and continue the broader war effort. Strategically, it made sense. But strategy does not account for the weight of leaving. Under cover of darkness, MacArthur departed by boat bound for Australia. Before leaving, he made his now famous promise. He would return. For the men remaining behind, the situation was more immediate. Command passed to Jonathan Wainwright. He was a career officer shaped by years of service, known more for his sense of duty than for personal ambition. What he inherited was not a stable command, but a deteriorating situation with few realistic options. The Philippines were effectively cut off. Supply lines stretched across vast distances, and Japanese control of the sea and air made reinforcement nearly impossible. Every attempt to resupply faced overwhelming risk. Wainwright understood the reality of the situation. He knew that the campaign could not be won as it stood. The best that could be hoped for was time for the United States to regroup, to rebuild, and to eventually return. So the objective shifted. Not victory but delay. Not triumph but survival for as long as possible. And that came at a cost measured in human terms. On Bataan, conditions worsened steadily. Rations were reduced again and again. Soldiers who had once been well equipped now struggled simply to maintain their strength. Fatigue became constant. A young Filipino soldier might share what little food he had with others, uncertain when the next meal would come. Letters home became less frequent, not for lack of desire, but because the connection to the outside world felt increasingly uncertain. Medical staff worked with what they had, improvising where they could. Treatments were repeated, supplies reused, and reassurance offered, even when confidence was fading. The strain showed in quiet ways: slower movement, shorter conversations, longer silences. Despite it, all the line held for months. Until it didn't. In April 1942, after prolonged resistance, Bataan fell. The surrender of those forces led to a forced march that would later be remembered as one of the most difficult episodes of the campaign. Thousands of exhausted soldiers were moved under harsh conditions, and many did not survive the journey. For Wainwright, the situation continued to deteriorate. Remaining forces withdrew to Corregidor, a fortified island in Manila Bay. It was the last major position still under Allied control. But by then the outcome was becoming clear. The island was surrounded. Supplies were nearly gone. Reinforcements were no longer a possibility. Wainwright faced a decision that no commander wants to confront. Continue the fight knowing it would likely end in total loss of life, or surrender in the hope of preserving what remained. On May 6, 1942, he made his decision. He surrendered his forces. More than 80,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their arms. From a distance, it could be seen as defeat. But from where Wainwright stood, it was something else. It was a choice made to prevent further loss when no meaningful alternative remained. Surrender has its own kind of gravity. It is not marked by noise or movement, but by stillness. And by consequence. For Wainwright and his men, that consequence was captivity. They became prisoners of war, entering a system defined by uncertainty and hardship. Conditions varied from camp to camp, but were consistently difficult. Food was limited. Living conditions were basic. Survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and often sheer endurance. Wainwright was moved between locations over the course of his imprisonment, from the Philippines to Taiwan and later to Manchuria. In captivity, rank carried little weight. He was no longer a commanding general in any practical sense. He was one among many sharing the same limitations as those around him. During those years, he carried a persistent belief that he had failed. Failed the men who had served under him. Failed the mission he had been given. Failed the promise that had been left behind. For more than 3 years, he lived with that understanding. Isolated from the outside world and unaware of how events would ultimately be judged. What he did not know was that his decision had preserved thousands of lives. Beyond the camps, the fall of the Philippines had wider consequences. For Japan, it marked a significant strategic gain, strengthening its position across Southeast Asia. For the United States, it was a moment of reassessment. The scale of the loss made it clear that the war in the Pacific would be long and demanding. It required a shift in approach, greater coordination, sustained effort, and a willingness to fight across vast distances. Progress came slowly, island by island, position by position. The promise made earlier in the war took on new meaning. It became a point of focus, not just a statement of intent, but a reminder of unfinished work. At home, the events in the Philippines were not easily set aside. Families waited for news that often did not come. Names appeared on lists of the missing. Questions were asked about what had happened and whether more could have been done. The phrase "Remember Bataan" began to circulate, carrying both grief and determination. It reflected a desire not only to understand the loss, but to ensure it was not forgotten. Over time, the direction of the war shifted. By 1945, Allied forces had regained momentum across the Pacific. Strategic positions were recaptured and supply lines improved. The balance began to change. That year, American forces returned to the Philippines. The earlier promise was fulfilled. But for Wainwright, the war had not yet ended. He remained in captivity until Japan's surrender in August 1945. When he was finally released, he was physically weakened but alive. He had endured nearly 3.5 years as a prisoner. Even then, he believed he would be remembered primarily for the decision to surrender. Instead, the response he received was very different. He was recognized for the circumstances he had faced and the judgment he had shown. The broader view of events had taken shape. His actions were understood not as a failure but as a difficult decision made under extreme conditions with the aim of preserving life. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. It was a formal acknowledgement of responsibility, carried out under pressure and of a choice, made with full awareness of its consequences. Recognition, however, does not erase experience. The years in captivity and the decisions that led there remained part of his life. Today, the story of Jonathan Wainwright is often overshadowed by larger narratives of victory. It is quieter, less direct, but it addresses a different aspect of war. Not how battles are won, but how decisions are made when victory is no longer possible. The Philippines have long since recovered from the physical impact of the war. Landscapes have changed. Cities have grown. Daily life has resumed its rhythm. Yet the history remains present. In memorials, in records, and in the recollections passed down over time. Wainwright's legacy is not defined by a single moment, but by the context in which that moment occurred. It reflects the difficulty of command when options are limited, and the responsibility that comes with it. Leadership is often associated with decisive action and clear outcomes, but sometimes it requires accepting outcomes that cannot be avoided and choosing the course that preserves what can still be saved. In that sense, Wainwright's decision represents a different kind of resolve. It was not about achieving victory, but about limiting loss. And that too is part of history. The war eventually came to an end. The conflict that had reshaped nations and lives became part of the past. But the questions it raised remain relevant. What defines success in a situation where success is no longer possible? What does responsibility look like under extreme pressure? And how should such decisions be remembered? Jonathan Wainwright believed he had fallen short of what was expected of him. History reached a different conclusion. It recognized the weight of the circumstances and the intent behind his actions. In the end, his story is not simply about surrender. It is about judgment, responsibility, and difficult choices that shape outcomes in ways not immediately understood. The events of 1942 have long since passed, but their meaning continues to be examined. Because history does not simply record what happened. It asks how it should be understood.